Very, very interesting, Annie, for sure. So appreciate you sharing that with us. And yeah, certainly for those that haven't, if you want to put in the chat what what you like to collect, or do you collect anything, we'll certainly entertain that as well. So welcome back, everybody. Hopefully everybody is enjoying this wonderful early summer preview we have here in Ohio today, getting up close to 80 degrees for some of us. So yeah, we're going to get started in a few minutes. Just, typical kind of etiquette that we've talked about all along. Today, we're going to be talking about climate change communication. And then we're going to have a discussion at the end of today's course on last week's step on the monitoring and implementation plan. So that's what we're going to get into today. Of course, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because this is the slide I'm introducing today's topic. We're really wrapping up the course, We'll talk about how you can best communicate now these findings that you have and your plan and thinking about the subject of climate change and how it applies to your management, applying those tips and tricks that you've learned along the way in your own adaptation story. This is as I always say when I'm out giving talks, climate change is so personal, right? It affects us all very personally, and that's the way we have our adaptation stories. And then we'll end the discussion again on the monitoring. So first, congratulations, you did it. This is session 6, and that means that you've completed all 5 steps of the adaptation workbook. Congratulations. It's a lot of work, obviously, and we're excited that you've made it this far. You may have some things that you'll want to tweak or finalize, and of course, these are living documents for you, as you'll see in a moment, but you should celebrate all the work and all of the hard work that you've put into it so far. So when the course began, we really outlined the 5 steps of this adaptation workbook, but it really boils down to 2 main questions, these 2 questions. How might climate change affect the resources that I manage, that you manage, and what management actions could help prepare for those effects? Those are the 2 broad questions, perhaps a little bit unsure when we were getting started a few weeks ago, because they're not simple questions, right? These are big questions, and there's no single answer to what we've been working with. A lot of variables at play, and those variables are different depending on what your particular story is. So at the beginning, a lot of questions. Maybe you weren't sure about where to start, and hopefully that has changed over the course of this this class. Whoops. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, really, it all comes back to place and goals, right? Your place on the land and your starting conditions, and what are your goals for the land? What do you want? And that really requires an understanding of your location, your management, history and experiences, observations of these sites that you manage. And all of that really helps inform your thinking on future actions, right? So hopefully you've got a bit more confidence now coming out of that, so the answers to these questions, we weren't here to give you any answers, right? This was just a way of allowing you to work through the questions and figure out your answers and to put it into action. So climate change, ultimately might not be the biggest threat that you have to your particular, land or our natural lands. There are a lot of threats out there, obviously, but it's something that we should all stop and consider as we do our jobs to manage this land. And there will always be uncertainty. From a climate perspective, we know there's a great deal of uncertainty. Science is, after all, based on the best knowledge that we have at the time. But we have a lot of tools and a lot of information to help us prepare now, right? And that's really what we I think, my opinion now, we should all be doing is preparing for what we're going to see. We do have evidence of your progress. We asked you questions before you started the workbook, and we've asked you questions when you started step 4. Not everyone was able to answer the questions, but from those that did, this is the evidence of your progress. One of the questions is that idea that you can identify what are the viable climate change adaptation strategies that can be applied to your local area. And again, that's understanding the vulnerabilities of your local area, and then what are the strategies that you can manage on your land. So we can see here, confidence was pretty low at the beginning of the course, but now you feel much more capable, right? So you're much more capable of identifying the viable climate change adaptation strategies that can be applied to your local area. We also had a big jump in the progress relating to translating broad adaptation strategies to actionable adaptation tactics in your area, right? So we saw a big jump in both of those, and that's just really, strong evidence and strong, basically a story that you've the changes that you've undergone, obviously, as you've gone through this course, understanding your land a little bit more and how to put those actions to good use. So now you have a document. You can download your climate change adaptation plan from the adaptation workbook, and you can use that to inform your other management, your larger management plan or another document that you might be working on. This workbook has really provided you with some of the science and research for climate change impacts and how it translates into your decisions and the actionable adaptation tactics that we talked about. So this is yours, right? This is your document, and it's detailed for your land and very useful in that regard. So just a couple things, just to remind you kind of where we are and what you have accomplished. We wanted you to be able to practice adaptation by using the adaptation workbook process. And now that you've done that, right, and you know how to use it in other scenarios, right? So you learn how to adapt using the adaptation process. You're invested, right? That process, you can use this process again. You will have these resources available to you, right? So you can come back and use the strategies in other situations. You've used your expertise, right, and your local knowledge to apply these tools to your local land or local project area. So all along, you've been thinking specifically about your location, what management goals that you have, what are your objectives, and are they within the kind of the context of what risk you're willing to take, and also what you're able to value, right, or what you do value rather. And of course, it's all documented. You've documented your intentions behind your thinking, and you can refer to this as you implement your management actions into the future. And kind of lastly, part of this whole process is about creating a community of practice, right? Even though we are meeting virtually in this environment that we have, we hope you've had a chance to talk to others in the group or those with similar projects, to make connections, to learn new things, help us improve this tool as well. So really, I think there's a lot of appreciation for joining this cohort of practitioners and thinking about climate change adaptation. I think this process hopefully is repeated often over the coming years as more and more of us talk peer-to-peer to raise these communities of practice. I think that's really vital to the success of becoming more climate resilient into the future. So in terms of wrapping things up, we'll be talking about climate change communication today, and then we'll be using these ideas to share your adaptation story for everyone next week. We'll provide some of the instructions today about finishing up your work in the adaptation workbook as well. Those details will come at the end of today's session, okay? All right, so hopefully I don't go too fast through this, but we're gonna make up a little bit of time here. We're really diving into that climate change communication, right? It's one thing to communicate on the hows and whys of your new plan, right? But bringing climate change into the mix adds another layer of complexity, another layer to navigate, and to be able to communicate that effectively. As somebody who talks about climate change a lot, I still find myself inadequate at times in terms of addressing different audiences. And so climate change communication is an ongoing process. Increasingly, a lot more professionals it's really expected of us to integrate climate change into our own work, documents, activities. So we don't need to just understand, but we also need to communicate with others. And it's likely that you're communicating with a pretty diverse audience, right? That audience has different understandings and experiences, different expertise. So some of these climate change conversations, for instance, you may be having them in some stakeholder meetings about public lands, maybe more agency type discussions, a lot of it state agencies and regional and federal agencies, or even long-term economic forecasts, because all of this does have a socioeconomic impact on all of us. And so because these audiences are very different, those conversations are also going to be different. They're going to look different, right? It's about finding the identity of the group that we're discussing and finding those shared values when we're discussing these topics. So there are a few standard tips to help guide, right, you through any of these conversations. A good place to start is knowing your audience, right? We always need to know our audience when we're talking about communication, who they are and what they're thinking to the best of our ability. I mean, just by being in this course, I assume most of you are on board with the concepts of climate change and human-induced climate change and changes that we're seeing. But what does the rest of the country look like, right? There's this excellent resource from Yale program on climate change communication. It started in 2019. Really, they've been conducting surveys to highlight and illustrate U.S. beliefs. Risk perceptions, policy support, behaviors, all of this around climate change. They've taken a lot of these results from the surveys and put them into very illustrative maps that are easy to comprehend and summarize really well how Americans are thinking about climate change. They bend these responses into 6 categories. We refer to these as the 6 Americas, okay? From alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive in terms of different policy beliefs and different beliefs in general. So we can see right away that most of the population is alarmed or concerned when it comes to climate change, the highest belief in climate change. And most are motivated to address it. Those are excellent things. And we've seen the needle shift over time toward the alarmed and concerned areas, right? So it's comforting to know that there's a lot more folks, I think, that think similarly to us. These surveys are continuously updated on ongoing, so if you'd like to take the survey online or look at other questions, you can do so there at the link provided. But let's dive into a couple of these here, getting into public perceptions on a national level, risk perceptions and policy support, et cetera. This is some information we pulled out on public beliefs, and you can see a majority of the United States in 2020 thinks global warming is happening, 72%. Still a majority, but less of a majority of people think that climate change is caused mostly by humans. We can see about 32% of the respondents believe that climate change is just natural changes. Slightly fewer people, surprisingly, are convinced that scientists think that global warming is happening, with some respondents kind of noting that there's a lot of disagreement among scientists. Okay, now the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has concluded that 97% of climate scientists have concluded that human-caused climate change is happening. I myself am among that 97%. Right? So it's really interesting to see how the country thinks about scientists versus scientists themselves. And then finally, many Americans believe that global warming is affecting weather. So all of these are in the majority. There's a lot of similarly thinking folks out there, but we can kind of dive into a little bit more of the details of these as well. So, really thinking about public perceptions on risk. These are our risk perceptions. A lot of data here. But some of the things that we can note, for instance, over 70% of respondents, the second one down, think that climate change will harm plants, animals, and future generations, right? That's big, that's very important. That's motivation to have action, right? 65% believe that climate change will harm people in the developing countries, and 56% of people believe that climate change is already harming people in the US. I'm one of them, I consider myself there. Right? That we're already seeing climate change is an issue now, not just a future issue, right? Many of the studies have concluded that communities most vulnerable, we know that those that are most vulnerable to climate change tend to be the least prepared, right? To manage these and recover. A lack of resources, children, the elderly, indigenous peoples, and those with pre-existing health conditions are especially vulnerable to a lot of things that we see, from extreme flooding to extreme drought, heat, poor air quality. All of these are linked. You've heard it before when I say climate change is a threat multiplier. It makes everything we do that much harder to deal with. And then you get compounding issues like climate change and COVID, right? Polar vortex events and not getting vaccines out in time, right? A lot of that double complexity there with climate change. So, you know, a lot of that vulnerability falls on the low income communities, right? And they're exposed to multiple environmental hazards this way. So what's going on here with the scientists too, thinking about, and you know, 71% of people think that climate change will harm plants and animals and future generations, but only 55% believe that scientists think climate change is happening, right? So there's a disparity here. There's a gap in how we're communicating about climate change with all of our partners. This might be a lack of transparency in our goals, for instance, or objectives. Maybe we're talking about it, or maybe we're not communicating in ways that resonate or make sense to the public, right? So a lot of times I'm talking to farmers. I have to make it, I have to reach a farming audience, right? And I just, you know, with the concepts too, that a lot of farmers are still very much interested in profitability, right? It's just, you know, how can we become economically and environmentally sustainable? So finding ways and finding those shared values when we're communicating is very, very important here. So there is a gap in that climate change communication, a big gap, right? So one of the ways that we can overcome that is looking even down into our individual county level, into our local communities. What does your community think, right? These maps are great because you can look at the results by state, county, congressional districts. If you look by county, you can get the opinions of a random slice really of your neighbors, right? And you can compare how these opinions match the state, the rest of the nation, a little bit more detail about the local area and how your management and adaptation story might fit when you're resonating and thinking about communicating with your climate change and strategy to those within your county as well. And it's not just the US. We know many parts of the world are certainly in tune with the changes that we're seeing with climate change. And so when we think about, you know, other areas like Canada, for instance, and perceptions on climate change, this is a study looking at the foresters in Canada and their perceptions, finding that more are concerned with climate change than the general population of Canada. So foresters more concerned than in the general population, which makes sense because, you know, people are in the woods just like all of us here, observing the changes on a regular basis. We see those, right? But they tend to agree with the current forest practices that they are insufficient. They're not adequate enough to really address the impacts that we're seeing now on our forests, let alone into the future and the adaptation strategies there. So these are, you know, these results really show as land managers, we have a very important position here to show the need for change, right? I see all of your projects as these shining examples in Ohio for the need to change and show how work towards these goals and these objectives are really setting the appropriate plans to manage climate change even into the future. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Patricia, and she's going to lead you now through several slides and discussion as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. I just need to get my slides up. Okay, great. So all this is to say there are a lot of resources and research out there to get a better understanding of what our audiences perceive, believe, and value so that we can begin tailoring our messages about climate change to those specific audiences. And aligning your messaging with these factors will make your conversations more impactful, give you a little more bang for your buck. And it's one thing to know your audience, to look at these maps and piece together who your audience is and what they think. But then it's a whole other thing to actually connect with them. And listening is a huge part of this process and one of the most important parts of this process. So being able to create opportunities to truly absorb, understand, and take in who these people are will be absolutely critical to then reflecting their values in your work and gaining support for what you're trying to do. Shared values can be an important point to work from when you're having these conversations. Appealing to values helps audiences recognize climate change as a personally meaningful issue. Trying to connect with something that your community cares about will help get them to listen. So maybe you can frame your conversation around local wildlife, food security, or whiskey barrel production can be a popular topic. So just find out what they are most passionate about and then try to talk about climate change impacts and possible solutions around this shared topic. So while individual values are important, we also want to focus on these self-transcending values too, so that people recognize their importance in the big picture. What we mean by self-transcendence is considering one's self an integral part of the universe and thinking beyond individual person, like thinking about what we can do now to make sure that our children have a better future and their children have a better future. So in our communication, this can look like prioritizing healthier ecosystems that are more resilient to long-term future changes, as opposed to making the messaging about immediate achievements or gratification that can keep the focus on the near term. So that's not to say that harvesting timber, you know, is bad or anything like that. Livelihoods and subsistence are important too, and a lot of people need to think about that day-to-day survival. But we can start thinking more expansively about how those short-term goals fit into those long-term goals in order to do that, to prioritize the forest health and the well-being of future ecosystems and generations. And we also want to make sure that we have connection between local observations and impacts, which will help to reduce these distance issues that pop up when we're communicating about climate change. So distance issues come from thinking in 3 different ways. So we can get distance in space. It's not happening here. We can get distance in time. It's not happening now. Or we can get distance in species. It's not happening to us specifically. So we all see these charismatic megafauna like the polar bear, who is often the poster child for global warming. We can appreciate the cuteness and then we can move on because the plight of the polar bear is happening in the Arctic. It's not happening in Ohio. It's not affecting us right now because the ice is melting, but sea level rise isn't really reaching us here yet. And you're not a polar bear, I'm not a polar bear, and I've never seen one up close, nor do I think I would want to. As cute as they are, I've heard they're not that friendly. So we can feel for the polar bear, but we need to also be reducing that distance in order to reveal how climate change is happening locally. And we need to motivate ways of thinking and behaviors that help support our efforts. And so, you know, maybe it's not about the polar bears, maybe it's about increasing heat in Ohio and how that's affecting the occurrence of drought and crop failure on my farm, and it's happening to me. And connecting local issues to local action is ultimately more effective because when you can bring specificity to the topic, it just works better. For example, we might expect that within the next 20 years, we'll see a 10 to 20% increase in these big, heavy 3-inch rain events. And that's expected to result in more erosion and more soil loss or just more standing water, which can be really problematic. So in this example, we're being specific in the timing, we're being specific in the amount of change, and also in the potential impacts on important resources that we care about in Ohio. So this level of detail, again, is helping your audience identify ways that climate change may make our forests and farms change, and how it might put certain communities at risk. So you've been exploring these regional impacts throughout this course for your project area, and at this point you're fairly well versed in these topics. And another way to make impacts more specific and connect to local audiences is to reference well-known weather events. This might sound a little counterintuitive because we're usually told that individual weather events cannot be easily attributed to climate change, because climate change is about long-term averages and over long time periods. But they are part of the climate record, and we can use these events to talk about how climate change is making these extremes more common, and how we're seeing increased damage to our fields, our forests, and our human communities. And another thing we can draw from these events is how those communities have come together to address damages and long-term risk related to future weather events. These things bring people together, and I've seen it firsthand in my neighborhood during a devastating rain event that washed out roads and all kinds of infrastructure. I've never seen most of my neighbors until the aftermath of that storm. And when we're being specific about our local impacts, we can also list them as multiple reasons for implementing adaptation strategies in our climate change focused management plans. So maybe we want to change our cover crops to reduce the risk of impacts like pests, diseases, and warmer temperatures. So thinking about those local extreme events, changing our cover crop can also help stabilize the soil and protect it against heavy rainfall and increased wind events. So this is, just an example of how the benefits of one idea can help reduce the severity and the risk of many different impacts. So kind of building a case. Okay, so we're connecting with our audience, we're learning about their values, and we're making it specific about local conditions and impacts. What we don't necessarily want to do is get bogged down in politics, which can be a barrier to conversations about climate change. We know that climate change is about science, and it's not a political issue, but some people have politicized it. But we luckily have some tricks to engage everyone in the climate change conversation, regardless of their political affiliation. So as we've already talked about, identifying local impacts will help people from across the political spectrum have greater support for policy action. Topics like drought and fire can resonate with people from diverse backgrounds who have diverse values at stake. And other themes that resonate widely with everyone include beauty, responsibility, if you can think of the Only You Can Prevent Forest Fires campaign, that's very effective, energy, security, jobs, cultural tradition, and sentimentality are just a few other things that people can really gather around on. And we want to be sensitive to people's emotions. If we emphasize the terrible, fatalistic aspects of climate change without discussing the solutions, it's going to make people feel helpless, and it's going to make them disengage and go play video games or read novels. On the other hand, if we want to empower our audience, we have to focus on the solutions and the benefits. We have to use positive and productive messages. We want to make people feel that they're part of the climate change and that they can do something about climate change, whether it's recycling or planting future adapted species or providing educational programming at a public event. We just have to change that mentality from why bother to I can do this, with examples, ideas, and steps that the audience can take to do something locally and empower some action. In the workbook, of course, you've already completed this productive messaging simply by identifying your impacts and then identifying your adaptation actions. So in other areas of your work, you can extend this thinking to provide specific examples of benefits, solutions, and actions that empower people and systems. So in this example, we're experiencing intense precipitation events, and so it makes sense to do things like plan harvests in order to avoid stream crossings and steep slopes or other wet areas, or relocate roads and skid trails in super wet areas, or to leave wider buffers along waterways. When you lay out the risk and also the benefit of changing the way that you do things, you can sometimes get more people on board with what you're trying to do. And it may seem obvious, but if we don't want to make climate change a political issue, then we don't want to rely on politicians or the media to communicate for us. If we use trusted messengers who use simple, clear messages that are repeated often by a variety of trusted voices, we can get more people to listen. So those trusted messengers can be us, now that we're all in a climate change community of practice. It can be other trusted peers in the communities, depending on who your audience is. Maybe they're scientists, maybe they're health professionals, maybe they're recreation organizations. Who are those champions that you can get to get their people to listen to this message? And these principles of adaptation communication are supported by the Adaptation Society, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, who wrote a living guide to the principles of climate change adaptation, which outline fundamental principles for engaging in professional activities in the field of climate adaptation. These principles also underpin everything that we at NIACS do, all of the education and training activities for adaptation professionals, climate affected natural resource professionals. So you can also check out their resources if you want to learn more or search their database for climate professionals in your region that could become those trusted messengers for your project. And so telling your adaptation story has a lot of benefits. It helps you gather support, reach a broader audience, and communicate key lessons. More people are thinking about climate change than ever, so the more you're out there talking about it confidently, you'll have access to a broader audience and you'll ultimately get a bigger following. At this stage of the process, I know that many of you are now thinking about how to fund your projects. So appeals for funding start with effective communication and storytelling. And succinct messaging is going to sneak that message in the smallest amount of time possible, so someone might actually get to hear your story. This is also a great time to share key lessons learned. You're going to want to tell your story to other people like you and help build their confidence in tackling this stuff. Now that you have a better picture of what it looks like to take action and adapt to climate change, you are now someone that others can look to see the examples of what that looks like, and maybe even make them believe that it's something that they can do. And there are other benefits to telling your adaptation story. It's not only a chance to talk about climate change and how it's an integral part of your work or your lives, but it can also give you an opportunity to highlight the co-benefits of good management. A really good example is that by taking action now, we can extend the life of our ecosystem and also achieve our management goals. We're managing for long-term benefits, ecosystem function, we're managing for a range of future conditions, and this is all a part of the climate change adaptation plan. So you can make your story about your land or project and just getting that good management done. So what makes a good story? I think we all have an appreciation for good storytellers. Some people may have that natural tendency, but we can all become good storytellers with a little bit of practice and some key pointers. We already talked about tailoring to your audience. So think about how the adaptation plan you describe might be communicated differently for a different audience. Maybe not the one that immediately comes to your mind, or, you know, if you immediately thought of a board of directors or your direct supervisor, then what would it look like if you communicated this to a group of students instead? So you also want to set up a logical sequence to connecting the series of dots to a coherent story. So you'll want to include detail to a level of specificity that gets your point across. You'll want to indicate that you really thought it through. So expressing again that intentionality, and then back it up with sound logic and rationale. But be careful not to overload your story with all the information in your plan. So some of you have some really big, complicated plans, but the bigger picture here is how does your story relate to climate change and vulnerabilities, and how is that that story giving us a really great vision for your project under climate change. So we'll move from key point to key point here. This is an example storyline that we can follow. So we'll start with your place and your purpose, and we'll move on to key impacts from climate change, and then adaptation actions to address those impacts. And then we'll end with our outcomes and benefits of those actions. So does that sound a little familiar to you guys? Anything you've done recently? It should. You've already done all this. Your adaptation plan has set you up with these key strategies in mind. So paired with all of these other tips on climate change communication, you are totally equipped to tell your adaptation story. If not today, then next week. And that's good because you will next week. So for next week's class, our last class, we're going to be using that time as presentation time for you all to share your adaptation story. So hopefully you're not feeling overwhelmed. You shouldn't. Your presentations will be very short, so we're going to do them in 5 minutes and with 5 slides. And we're limiting it to 5 minutes just to make sure that everyone gets a chance to go and that we have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. So you'll be able to ask your classmates just questions about their projects, and they can ask about yours. This is about a minute per slide, and someone will let you know in the chat box when you're ready to reach your 5-minute mark. If you're going over, we'll kind of nudge you, so keep an eye on that. And then what we're, again, just trying to get you to do is to simplify your plan into essentially a 5-minute elevator pitch to tell your story. So not all your details are going to be included, but we really want to know why the place is important, what's at risk, and what you're going to do about it. So we want you to get creative. Maybe you have some pictures of your property. Maybe you have some Bob Ross style illustration skills and you can just paint us a picture, or if you have a map, that works too. Basically, we want to see more of your project area, so throw in some good illustrations. We're going to send you a link in the newsletter. Check the newsletter. We have a link to this slide deck there. So these 5 slides are provided to you. And you just have to download these slides and then change them up however you want to. You can stick to the rough outline on these slides, but then change it to make it work for you. So on the first slide, we want to know your project name and your location. And then we also want you to describe your property and what makes it special. What are the major goals and objectives that you focused on in this course? So basically you're briefly summarizing your step 1 here. And then next, we'll have you describe the climate change impacts, your challenges, or your opportunities that are most important to your story. So here you can draw your ideas from either step 2 or step 3. You don't have a lot of room on these slides, so again, just pick the ones that really reflect your project the best. You don't have to include everything here, but you know, what would make that compelling conversation at the water cooler? And then next, we'll have you talk about your adaptation actions from step 4. So tell us why this is the best action for the challenges that you addressed in the slide before. This is a really cool place to talk about your new and different approaches, or maybe, you know, you're just using a typical management strategy that also addresses a climate change impact. So tell us what the case may be. How are you tweaking things? Are you bringing in anything new and different? And then lastly, you'll have an outcomes slide. So overall, what is it that you're trying to achieve by working on this project and thinking about climate change? This outcomes box really hits it. You know, why is all of this important? What is that big long-term outcome you're trying to achieve? So again, we'll send a link for all of these PowerPoint slides in our weekly newsletter, but let me know if you need those in a separate email for any reason. So this is essentially your homework, which is due next week. So for our next session, we just want you to finish up your adaptation workbook, including your homework number 6. So just wrap that up as best as you can, and then you know, we'll provide those templates in order to summarize your project to share with the course next week. And if you want to dive in, you can do some optional reading on climate change communication. There are 2 resources listed below. The links to these are in your course syllabus, and they will be in the newsletter as well. So you can peruse those at your leisure. And then I just want to create a plug. You guys have been amazing throughout this entire course. And I know that each of your projects would be an amazing adaptation demonstration that we could post online. These are short. You can typically read through these in a couple of minutes, and they're much like these presentations that you're going to be preparing for next week. And so we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I hate that expression, but sorry for using it. we can just get both of those co-benefits is such a nicer way to say it. There's co-benefit in doing your presentation. So hopefully you'll become one of these online adaptation demonstrations. There'll be a link to a template if you want to try filling that out yourself. Or if you want us to take a stab at it, we can use your adaptation workbook in order to create an adaptation demo for you. The status of these demos can be changed online. I can change the status at any point in time. So we can have your status be just in the planning stage. You're just thinking about doing this adaptation plan. And then as you like start implementing things, we can change that status to, you know, action, where we're doing things, and we can update, you know, what exactly it is you're doing. So they're dynamic, and all you have to do is email me in order to change it or edit it. So with that, do we have any questions about what we're going to do next week? And then we have just a little bit of time to talk about monitoring. Any questions? Does that all sound good? You guys all confident you can share your adaptation story?
Yeah, I have the feeling we'll need a little bit more time, really. We can perhaps start with something. It is meant to be an ongoing thing, but I have the feeling, at least personally, lagging behind for sure. Oh.
Yes, and that's understandable. So I know some of you are, you know, you have a lot going on in your projects, and it's meant to take longer than the actual course, and that's totally fine. But I also know that you have some objectives for which you've already identified some possible adaptation actions. And so if you just want to focus on, you know, one or two objectives and follow those through the process and tell us, you know, about that small piece of your project, that would be really great too.
I guess for me, it's more to a point that Aaron made first in the lecture last week, is you know your place best. And I feel I don't really know the place. I'm just learning some strategies of how to learn about it. I've been associated specifically with sawmill wetlands for a year and a half now. And I think that's a bigger crux because I'm not really managing that land.
Mm-hmm. But you're working with Laura, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so if you two want to team up for your presentation, you can do it however you want to. You know, one of you can present the whole thing, or you can present, you know, a slide, and then Laura can present a slide. If you guys want to work together that way, that's totally fine too. So it should be one presentation per project. So for others who are working in a team, you can figure out how you want to work together for that presentation, or just assign somebody to do it for you. And then make the other one answer all the questions, right? Good questions. Okay, well, we can move into our last topic for today, which is just checking in about our monitoring.
Yep.
And go ahead, Aaron.
Yep, I'll take it over from Patricia here. Give her a second to take a breath. And yeah, so we want to kind of follow up on the monitoring aspects. And so we've got about 5 or 6 minutes. We're hoping that some of you are willing to share some of the aspects of the monitoring. So first, you know, how, you know, defining your monitoring variable, or that thing that you're going to measure. What are your monitoring variables? Is there somebody that would like to talk about that a little bit? You know, how are you going to tell whether you achieved your goals and your objectives?
I think for Sawmill, it'll be survivability. And if we start using some of the species that have been identified by the tree atlas that you gave us, like how those are doing, a little more assessment of how those are doing, like after winter, a rough winter versus a mild winter, that kind of stuff, that would be helpful. That if we share that knowledge with the rest of Central Ohio.
So survival rates of particular types of seedlings and species.
Right.
Yep. What about someone else with the monitoring variables? What are you going to be using to monitor your objectives?
I agree with Laura that it's really about survivability. And one of the things that I've learned from this project, which I am sadly so behind, it's not funny, but it's really valuable to me, and is that it's like my DNA coming through, that I am the keeper of the land. And I see that my job in terms of monitoring is to, first of all, be really good at my assessment of what already exists, which I think I know, but a real tree census, a real understanding of the health of each tree. I have 34 acres, so that's going to take some time. And then how am I going to bring the biggest, healthiest trees through what's that's happening now, but going to get a lot more severe. And that whatever survives on the other side, we will have at least started with what it looked like in the beginning, what didn't work, by keeping good records. And I probably won't be on the other side when these things come through, but somebody will, and they will then take up the monitoring. So I don't know that it's any more than that. It seems like a lot of work, but it feels like it's really valuable to say, what is each region on these 34 acres going to do? And then what's healthy, what's going to survive, and we're going to monitor it.
So Annie, continuing on from that, I mean, you've talked a little bit about how your criteria for success, and I'm assuming it's a certain percentage or certain species, but how are you going to implement this plan? How are you going to monitor? Really, what's that overall plan of gathering the data that helps you see that that you're monitoring the variables and reaching your goals?
Well, we're going to start out with a more sophisticated forest management plan. We're working with the forester, and he's going to be here in June. And so that'll give us sort of a demarcation. The other forest plan we had was just way too nebulous. And then, as I see it, I'm working with Cornell University with a student from there. Mm-hmm. And he is going to help me do a tree census. So we'll go around and measure trees and decide what we're going to do with each region. Because some of those areas we're going to leave for experiment. Some of them we're going to attract wildlife to keep them away from the trees that we're going to plant. And I think just, I'm not trying to fake this. I don't know. I just know if we are really careful about every tree that we decide has to live, then we're going to take some out, and then we're going to keep track of what we did, and then we're going to keep good records every year about how that tree's done. It's like our child. We're just going to keep pushing it along, getting it through college. So I don't know beyond that, Erin, because I feel like I have to do not just the adaptation plan, more of it, but I have to see more. I just have to experience more of some of the areas of the woodlands that I haven't even been to. Mm-hmm. My husband has, but I haven't. And so I just want to, I feel like I want to protect every tree, but I can't. So I really want to be harsh in my evaluation and decide what keeps, what goes, and then keep a really good journal.
Okay. Someone else want to talk about your variables or your success in implementation?
I'll take a quick stab.
Sure.
Just I think we're along the same lines as everybody else in deciding what survives and how they survive and what adapts. But different tech is one of our objectives, was to improve soil health and carbon sequestration to help with mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So one way we can do that is take some soil testing, do some soil testing, and really understand what's living in the soil and what how much carbon the activities that we do on the land are building carbon in the soil and holding on to that carbon.
So will you test your soil annually then, Jessica?
We talked about doing a baseline now and seeing what we have, and then I don't think we'll have to do annually, but I think maybe every 3 to 4 years. We're not going to change our land management that drastically. But I think every 3 to 4 years, maybe 5 at the most, and then see as we're building more carbon in the soil, if it's, and as the species change and become more dense and we get rid of invasives, if that changes the chemistry of the soil, but also we can look at the biology of the soil as well.
Yep. Those are great insights. And a lot of talk of that at the university too, and elsewhere in research. So, all right. Well, it is a couple of minutes after 4, so I don't want to keep anybody too long. But how about I throw it back to you, Patricia, and you can excuse the class, and we look forward to the presentations next week. I know I'm excited.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great week. If you have any additional questions, we'll stick around for a few more minutes, but I look forward to hearing your stories and just spending one last class period with you before our course comes to a close. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Welcome.
Hey, Petra and I are having trouble logging in, so I just wondered, should I just request a new password?